Today, on Armament Academy, we'll be discussing the history and evolution of the firearm. But before we can begin talking about firearms, first we really have to talk about the origin of black powder itself. Although as a side note, before the modern invention of smokeless powder, it would have been referred to simply as gunpowder. Therefore, for the rest of this video, we'll be calling it gunpowder for simplicity's sake. Now, today we know the three basic ingredients for gunpowder are saltpeter, known scientifically as potassium nitrate, sulfur, and carbon. This will be important information for the rest of the video, and you'll soon see why. We know that gunpowder originated in the Far East, more specifically, ancient China. The earliest recorded mention of anything resembling gunpowder comes from a text written in 142 AD by a Taoist alchemist named Wei Boyang, called Shouyi Santongshi, which roughly translated to English means kinship of the three. In this text, he describes three powders that, when mixed together, would, quote, fly and dance violently. Sounds familiar, huh? But then, we don't really hear much about it after that, until over 175 years later in 318 AD, during the Jin dynasty, where the Taoist philosopher Ge Hong records experiments in which alchemists were trying to create gold from various ingredients, which he named as saltpeter, pine resin, and charcoal, which when mixed together created a purple powder and arsenic vapors. Not exactly gunpowder, but not too far off either. Now, skipping forward about 490 years to the 9th century Tang dynasty, the first actual mentions of gunpowder in a text from 808 AD called the... I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. And then it's mentioned again about 50 years later in a Taoist text called Jinwan Miadao Yalu. These texts describe both early mixtures of gunpowder and the process of discovering gunpowder, with one early mixture being given as 6 parts saltpeter, 6 parts sulfur, and 1 part birthwort herb, with the birthwort herb being the source of the carbon. These texts also describe how dangerous the process of experimenting with gunpowder was, describing in one instance those who tried heating honey, saltpeter, sulfur, and realgar together ended up creating huge flames and smoke, often resulting in serious burns to the hands and face, or even burning down the houses and buildings they were working in. It's actually very likely that the discovery of the mixture we now know as gunpowder was kind of an accident. There's evidence to suggest that what they were really trying to create was an elixir of life to give them immortality, which is evident in the Chinese name for gunpowder, which is huiyao, or translated to English as fire medicine. Skipping forward again a bit, about 200 years later, to the Song dynasty, the earliest actual chemical, rather than alchemical, recipe for gunpowder is mentioned in a text called Wujing Zhangyao, the complete essentials for the military classics in English, written by Zhang Gongliang, sometime between 1040 and 1044. The encyclopedia of this text mentions a variety of mixtures and mechanisms, including the one for gunpowder and for a slow match for use in rockets and fireworks, as well as flame-throwing mechanisms that use the siphon principle, which is way too complicated for me to explain here. Anyways, the mixtures in these texts contain no more than 50% saltpeter, which is enough for an incendiary but not an explosive, unlike modern gunpowder. There's little to no evidence this particular text had any impact at all on warfare at the time, probably due to the fact it was written by a Song court advisor. And besides the wars against the Tanguts in the 11th century, China was actually mostly at peace during this time. Now we know that China had been using gunpowder in a production of fire and rocket arrows since at least the 10th century, with the first recorded military use being in 904, being utilized by the southern Wu during their siege of Yuzhang. Their effectiveness was so high that over the next century, more and more uses of fire arrows were recorded in battles of the time, with two notable examples being in 975, when the Song dynasty used fire arrows to destroy the fleet of the southern Tang, and in 994 when the Liao dynasty laid siege to the city of Zitong within the Song dynasty, where the Song repelled 100,000 troops with the aid of fire arrows. By 1083, the Song court records show they were producing hundreds of thousands of fire arrows for their armies. Now, this video isn't about fire arrows, it's about firearms, so let's talk about the first firearm, shall we? Enter the fire lance. The fire lance was kind of the predecessor to the hand cannon, which in itself is the predecessor to the handgun, but we'll come back to those at a later time. For now, let's focus on the fire lance. The earliest depiction of a fire lance that has been discovered comes from a piece of artwork on a silk banner from Dunhuang that's been dated to the year 950, although this depiction or dating is a little sketchy, at least in my opinion, because the earliest recorded use of fire lances was in 1132, where the Song utilized them against Jin forces during the Jin-Song Wars, which is 182 years later after the date the banner is from. Whatever the case may be, let's go ahead and talk about the construction of the earliest fire lances. The earliest fire lances were made of a short bamboo tube filled with gunpowder, with a slow match sticking out of the side like a fuse. This tube was then attached to the end of a pole arm, like a spear, which would then be ignited assumedly right before a charge towards enemies. Then ideally the fire lance would spew flames towards the enemy, like a mini flamethrower. Later on, it was common to mix iron pellets, pottery shards, and other random shrapnel into the gunpowder mixture, which when ignited would eject the shrapnel from the fire lance tube, creating an effect similar to the much later developed blunderbuss or the modern shotgun, albeit with less range and power. Now the first fire lances being made of bamboo were kind of a disposable item, only able to be used a few times, maybe even only once, before needing the bamboo tube to be replaced. Therefore, later on, the Jin adapted the technology from the Song, and also made improvements to the tube of the fire lance to make it last longer and become reusable. First with hardened paper, and then eventually with metal. At some point, the spearhead part of the fire lance was eliminated altogether, thanks to this improvement. And in addition to that, the amount of saltpeter in the gunpowder mixture could be increased, allowing for greater range and power. By 1257, there's evidence that some fire lances were firing wads of bullets that occluded the barrel and sat on top of the gunpowder charge, rather than mixed into it. And by 1276, almost all fire lances would have been metal-barreled. It should also be noted that around the same time, there also existed weapons known as eruptors, that would spew out things like poison gas or poisonous chemicals when ignited, but were mainly concerned about the bullet firing variety. Speaking of bullets, here's where the hand cannon, the precursor to the modern firearm, comes into play. The first recorded use of the hand cannon dates to 1287, where Yan Yurkin troops, led by Li Ting, put down a rebellion by the Mongol prince Nayan. You see, if we rewind a little bit to 1205, this small nation to the north invaded and managed to slowly conquer China over the years. And like most of the known world eventually, but that's also a story for a different time. After the Mongols conquered China, they put a new dynasty in place that was Mongol-controlled, called the Yuan dynasty. Well, eventually, of course, the Mongol Empire split into pieces, with the Yuan dynasty being one of the major ones. This is where the Prince Nayan comes in. Disturbed by Kublai Khan's estrangement of traditional nomadic Mongol tradition and ideals, he launches a rebellion against Kublai. This is where we get our first mention of the hand cannon, where it is said that in 1287 soldiers led by Li Ting carried hand cannons on their backs into the enemy rebel camp and caused great damage and confusion among the enemy troops. So much so that they supposedly even began attacking each other. Needless to say, things didn't go too well for Nayan. As his army broke apart, he was captured and subsequently executed immediately, and in a pretty terrible way too. On another note, at least two very early hand cannons from around this time period have been found. The earliest speculated dated one, coming from 1288, known as the Heiliongjiang gun, dated thusly because of the proximity to the rebellion in 1287 to 88. However, the earliest confirmed dated hand cannon comes from 1298, known as the Xanadu gun, which has an inscription confirming the date of production. These are the first true firearms in history: a metal barrel, a gunpowder charge, and a bullet or bullets that occlude the barrel and when ignited, propel a projectile. Now, as you can imagine, just about everybody would be trying to get their hands on this brand new, futuristic technology, and that's exactly what happened next, thanks mostly in part to the Mongols taking the technology with them in their conquest across the rest of Asia, the Middle East, and eventually even making its way to the fringes of Europe. With that being said, join me in the next video when we discuss further developments and spread of the firearm beyond China's borders, right here on Armament Academy. Thank you.